So for this week's assignment, I'm going to be referencing my notes that I have right next to me to do this recording. So yeah, I read both of the chapters that were assigned this week, which was chapter 6 and chapter 9, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I enjoyed from both of them. So what stood out to me in chapter 6 was that I realized the spice trade wasn't really held together by spices alone. So as we've talked throughout the semester, the spice trade, wasn't just spices, it was ideas, it was culture, it was all these different practices. So, before I took this class, I imagined the Silk Road as merchants just traveling from one landmark to the next and exchanging products. But in chapter 6, around pages 133 to 145, the author really argues that what really connected these trade routes was the expansion of Islam and the social networks that came with it. So I thought it was really interesting how the author spends time describing the market in Dushanbe. So at first I was kind of wondering why he was talking about all this stuff and even jokingly offering about herbal Viagra, which I thought was really funny. But I realized that he wasn't just showing that they were places where people traded and bought things. He was showing that this is where stories and memories and languages, traditions, and all these different ideas were exchanged. So it made me think a lot differently about a trade network and really what it was. So something else that really stood out to me was the discussion of Islam. So I think this was on page 138 to 145. I mostly associated Islam with military conquest before reading this chapter. So the author added a really deep layer of how Muslim merchants and financial systems shared ethical rules made long distance trade pretty stable. So there was also discussion of the Diwan al-Kharaj, which was interesting because it showed an economic system behind the spice trade, which I didn't really take the time to think about until I read this book and took this course. So it wasn't just individual merchants making money. There was rules about lending and taxation, investment and responsibility that allowed people from different regions to trust each other and keep trading. So in chapter 9, it kind of moves into what these networks eventually became. So between pages 198 to around 200, the author describes Zaytun, which was a modern-day Changsou, as the eastern end of the maritime Silk Road. So what I found interesting was that he doesn't describe just a Chinese city. He describes it as a multicultural place where Chinese, Arab, Persian, Indian, and Jewish culture kind of mixed together. So this kind of reinforced something that we've been talking about all semester, which was that spices weren't just commodities. They were a space where different cultures interacted every single day. So, oh man, I'm out of time. I also love the symbolism of that Anping Bridge in pages 189 to pages 201. At first, I thought this was just a historical landmark, but the more I read and the more I realized the bridges represents exactly what this chapter is about. The author says that it's called the Land of Bridges, and it was both literal and metaphorical. So the bridge physically connected different parts of China, but it also represented the trade connected the Far East with the Middle East. So I thought it was one of the strongest mental images in the book so far. And I was also pretty fascinated by the shipwreck in pages 201 to 203. So archaeologists found over 2.5 tons of preserved aromatic with things like frankincense, I can't pronounce it, myrrh, cardamom, peppers, cloves and cinnamon, saffron. And they also compared them with medieval shipping records. So this is one of the coolest things that I read in the book because it combined archaeology with written history. And it just makes me paint that mental image that we've been reinforcing throughout the semester that, these spices were the hot commodity. Everybody wanted them. And, to find a ship completely filled with them was just amazing. So, yeah.